In a pristine Nashville suburb, a 68-year-old woman was about to challenge everything her family thought they knew about her. What started as cardiac recovery took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her daughter-in-law's dismissive command. Margaret Maggie Holloway wasn't your typical grandmother. For 35 years, she had been a high school principal, known for handling difficult situations with quiet steel. When Jessica told her to just watch TV and rest, Maggie had no idea she was walking into a campaign to erase her. Her calculated rebellion would expose buried family secrets and lies that would shatter their carefully constructed suburban facade forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Maggie Holloway's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the passenger door handle of David's BMW, but not from her recent heart episode. The tremor came from recognition, the same feeling she'd experienced 35 years ago when walking into a new classroom for the first time, sensing immediately which students would challenge her authority. The pristine suburban neighborhood stretched before her like a magazine spread, all manicured lawns and coordinated mailboxes, each house a monument to careful planning and controlled appearances. "You sure you're feeling up to the stairs, Mom?" David's voice carried the forced cheerfulness she'd learned to recognize during his teenage years when he was avoiding difficult conversations. His eyes darted toward the front door where Jessica stood framed in the entry, her smile as perfectly arranged as the autumn wreaths flanking the doorway. "I've been climbing stairs longer than you've been breathing, son." Maggie's response was automatic, honed by decades of deflecting well-meaning concern that felt more like condescension. She studied Jessica's posture, arms crossed despite the welcoming gesture, weight shifted slightly away from the door as if ready to retreat. In her years as principal, Maggie had learned to read body language the way others read books. Jessica descended the steps with practiced grace, her designer heels clicking against the stone pathway. "Margaret, welcome to our home." The emphasis on "our" was subtle but unmistakable, like the way she air-kissed Maggie's cheek without actually making contact. "I hope you'll be comfortable during your stay." The pause before stay hung in the autumn air like morning frost, beautiful on the surface, but warning of colder temperatures ahead. Maggie had heard that same calculated pause from parents who wanted to discuss their child's behavior, but hoped the problem would resolve itself without their involvement. "I appreciate your hospitality, Jessica." Maggie's voice carried the diplomatic tone she'd perfected for school board meetings, polite but revealing nothing. She noticed how Jessica's eyes flickered toward the neighbors' windows, tracking who might be watching this family tableau. David bustled between them with nervous energy, retrieving Maggie's suitcase from the trunk. "Let me show you to your room, Mom. Jessica's fixed it up real nice." His laugh sounded hollow, the same forced lightness he'd used when explaining his father's sudden business trips during those difficult years. The guest room tour felt like a carefully choreographed performance. Jessica glided ahead, pointing out amenities with the practiced enthusiasm of a real estate showing. "The bathroom's right here. Fresh towels, of course. And this little table by the window gets lovely morning light. Perfect for reading." Her tone suggested reading was a quaint hobby, like collecting pressed flowers. "I was thinking about the office space downstairs," Maggie began, remembering the cozy den David had shown her during previous visits. "Oh, that's David's work area now," Jessica interrupted smoothly. "So much more efficient to have everything centralized, but this room has everything you'll need for a comfortable recovery." The word recovery carried weight, a reminder of why Maggie was here, and, by extension, why her presence was temporary. Maggie ran her fingers along the guest room dresser, noting the small decorative bowl placed precisely where someone might set their keys or jewelry. A subtle territorial marker. "It's lovely," she said, though she noticed the window faced the back fence rather than the garden David had mentioned. Small things. But Maggie had learned that small things often revealed the largest truths. Dinner that evening unfolded like a performance where only Jessica knew all the lines. She dominated the conversation with updates about her real estate ventures, name-dropping clients and neighborhoods with the casual confidence of someone establishing her credentials. The Hendersons, the ones with the lake house, they're looking at that new development in Belle Meade. I told them location, 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 but some people just don't understand property values. David nodded along, cutting his chicken into precise pieces that he moved around his plate more than ate. When he attempted to steer the conversation toward Maggie's teaching career, Jessica smoothly redirected. Teaching must have been so fulfilling. Of course, the world's changed so much since then. Everything's digital now. Algorithms determining property values, social media marketing. She waved her fork expansively, encompassing some vast technological gulf that apparently separated Maggie's past relevance from Jessica's present importance. Students haven't changed, Maggie observed quietly. They still need someone who believes in them. She watched Jessica's expression tighten almost imperceptibly, the same look she'd seen on helicopter parents who resented implications that their involvement wasn't always helpful. Oh, absolutely, Jessica agreed with bright insincerity. Though I imagine discipline must have been such a challenge. Kids today have no respect for authority. Her tone suggested she was discussing an extinct species, something quaint and historical. David cleared his throat. Mom always said the best teaching happened when students didn't even realize they were learning. His voice carried genuine warmth, a brief glimpse of the sun Maggie remembered before Jessica's smile tightened another notch. How philosophical, Jessica murmured, already standing to clear plates. Margaret, you must be exhausted. Don't worry about helping. You just focus on resting and getting your strength back. Later, as Maggie unpacked her few belongings, she discovered that the closet contained only half the space she'd expected. Jessica's out-of-season clothes occupied the other half, leaving Maggie to arrange her things in the narrow remaining section. On the dresser, her small collection of family photos looked lost among Jessica's decorative objects, like wildflowers transplanted into a formal garden. The house settled into evening quiet, but Maggie had learned during her years as principal that important conversations happened when people thought no one was listening. She moved carefully to her partially open door, not intentionally eavesdropping, but unable to avoid hearing Jessica's voice carrying from the kitchen below. Can't go on indefinitely, David. We have our own lives to consider. Jessica's tone was different now, stripped of its public performance warmth. I understand she's your mother, but we need to manage the situation before it becomes permanent. She just needs time to recover. David's voice was defensive but weak, like a student offering an excuse he didn't believe himself. Recovery is one thing, dependency is another. The sound of dishes being loaded into the dishwasher punctuated Jessica's words. I'm not being cruel, I'm being practical. We can't let emotion cloud our judgment about what's best for everyone. Maggie closed her door quietly and sat on the edge of the bed that felt both too soft and too narrow. Through the back window, she could see the neighbor's house where warm light spilled from the kitchen windows. She thought of her own home 3 hours away, sitting empty except for the housekeeper who checked on things twice a week. The heart episode had scared her, not the medical emergency itself, but the sudden awareness of her vulnerability. The realization that the independence she'd fought so hard to maintain could disappear in an instant. But listening to Jessica discuss managing the situation, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced since her early days as a young principal facing down a school board that thought she was too inexperienced to handle the job. It was the quiet burn of being underestimated, the steel-edged determination that had carried her through 35 years of shaping young minds and navigating small-town politics. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to Ruby May's number, then stopped. Not yet. First, she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with. Jessica might think she was managing a convenient problem, but she had no idea she'd just awakened something in Maggie that had been dormant too long. The clock on the nightstand read 9:47 p.m., and the house hummed with the kind of artificial silence that meant people were actively avoiding conversation. Maggie smiled to herself, an expression her former students would have recognized as the look she got just before turning a particularly challenging classroom situation into a teaching moment. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin her own education about this carefully constructed household. And perhaps Jessica would learn that experience, when properly applied, could be the most formidable force of all. The morning light filtering through the back-facing window felt different than Maggie had expected, cooler, more distant. She'd awakened at 5:30 a.m., a habit from decades of early school schedules, and lay listening to the house's rhythms. Jessica's heels clicked purposefully across hardwood floors at 6:15, followed by the controlled chaos of morning preparation. David's shower ran exactly 12 minutes. The coffee maker gurgled to life on a timer. Maggie dressed carefully in her navy slacks and cardigan, the same type of professional attire that had carried her through countless difficult conversations with obstinate parents and defensive teenagers. When she entered the kitchen at 7:20, Jessica was already arranging items on the granite countertop with surgical precision. Yogurt parfait, fresh berries, artisanal granola in separate glass containers. "Good morning," Maggie offered, moving toward the coffee maker. "Beautiful kitchen. Mind if I help with breakfast?" Jessica's smile appeared instantly, bright and impenetrable. "Oh, you sweet thing, absolutely not. You're supposed to be resting, remember?" She glided between Maggie and the stove with practiced grace. "I've got everything under control. David likes his eggs over medium, and I've already started the bacon." The dismissal was gentle but absolute. Maggie found herself relegated to the breakfast bar, watching Jessica orchestrate the morning routine like a conductor managing a symphony. When David appeared, tie slightly askew, Jessica was all ready, preparing his plate. "Morning, Mom." David kissed Maggie's cheek quickly, his attention immediately drawn to the tablet Jessica handed him. "Property listings for the Millers. They want something in Green Hills." "The market's moving so fast right now," Jessica said, settling beside David with her own perfectly portioned breakfast. "I told them we'd need to act quickly. These Nashville buyers don't hesitate." Maggie sipped her coffee and observed. Jessica touched David's arm when making points about property values. She anticipated his needs: more coffee, the sports section, his reading glasses. The performance was flawless, but Maggie recognized it as exactly that. A performance designed to demonstrate indispensability. After David left for work, Maggie ventured toward the sliding doors leading to the backyard. The October morning was crisp, perfect for working in the small garden she'd noticed yesterday. "I thought I might help with the flower beds," she said, watching Jessica load the dishwasher with mechanical efficiency. "I used to maintain quite a garden back home." Jessica paused, her hand stilling on a coffee mug. When she turned, her smile had shifted, still present, but somehow sharper. "Margaret, that's so thoughtful, but honestly, you should just watch TV and rest." The words came out with practiced sweetness, but there was steel underneath. "That's what recovery means, isn't it? Letting your body heal?" The phrase hit Maggie like a physical blow. Not the words themselves, but the tone. The same condescending patience she'd heard teachers use with students they'd written off as incapable. The dismissal was complete. "Your contributions aren't needed. Your experience doesn't matter. Your presence is tolerated but not valued." "I appreciate your concern," Maggie replied carefully, "but I'm not an invalid. Light gardening might actually help." "I really think it's best if you follow doctor's orders," Jessica interrupted, her voice carrying the false authority of someone who'd never spoken to Maggie's cardiologist. "Besides, I have a landscaping service. Everything's handled." Maggie excused herself and stepped onto the back patio alone. The garden beds were indeed immaculate, professionally maintained, geometrically perfect, and completely sterile. No evidence of personal touch, no vegetables mixed with flowers, none of the comfortable chaos that made a garden feel lived in. Like everything else in Jessica's domain, it was beautiful and soulless. She decided to walk. The neighborhood sidewalks were pristine, lined with mailboxes that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent. At the corner, she noticed a man in his 40s working in his yard, coaxing life from a small vegetable patch that looked refreshingly authentic among the professional landscaping. "Brave soul, growing tomatoes this late in the season," Maggie commented as she paused by his fence. The man looked up, his face creasing into a genuine smile. "Tommy Chen," he said, wiping soil from his hands before extending one over the fence. "And you're right, probably too optimistic. But my daughter loves cherry tomatoes, so I'm hoping for a few more weeks." "Maggie Holloway. I'm staying with my son David just down the street." She gestured toward Jessica's pristine lawn. "Your garden has character. That's rare in this neighborhood." Tommy's laugh was rueful. "My ex-wife used to say the same thing, though she didn't mean it as a compliment. Apparently, authentic doesn't maintain property values." His expression softened. "You settling in okay? I saw you arrive yesterday." Something in his tone, understanding perhaps, or recognition of displacement, made Maggie pause. "Still adjusting," she said carefully. "Adjusting's hard," Tommy replied, turning back to his tomatoes. "Especially when you're not sure if you're supposed to be grateful or resentful." That evening, as Maggie sat in the guest room with the television murmuring in the background, she reflected on the day's small humiliations. The morning's dismissal had been followed by Jessica's pointed suggestions throughout the day. Perhaps Maggie would enjoy a nice nap. Maybe she'd like to read in her room where it was quiet. Wouldn't it be lovely to have some peaceful time to herself? Each suggestion had been delivered with perfect courtesy, making any objection seem unreasonable. But Maggie understood the strategy. She'd seen it used by master manipulators who knew how to isolate their targets without appearing cruel. Make someone feel like a burden while maintaining plausible deniability about your intentions. The realization crystallized as she stared at the television screen she wasn't really watching. Jessica wasn't just being inhospitable. She was implementing a systematic campaign to make Maggie invisible. Keep her occupied with meaningless activities, separated from household decisions, reduced to the role of grateful recipient rather than contributing family member. It was, Maggie realized, a masterclass in psychological diminishment, and Jessica had underestimated her target completely. Maggie smiled. The same expression her former students had learned meant someone was about to receive an education they weren't expecting. Jessica wanted her to watch TV and rest. Fine. But she'd discover that principals learned to be very observant during quiet moments, and that sometimes the most dangerous opponents were the ones who appeared to be cooperating. Tomorrow, Maggie decided, her real education about this household would begin. Maggie's phone buzzed at exactly 9:15 a.m., interrupting the morning news program Jessica had subtly encouraged her to watch. Ruby May's name appeared on the screen like a lifeline thrown to someone who'd been treading water longer than she'd realized. "Well, sugar, how's life in the big city treating you?" Ruby May's voice carried the familiar warmth of East Tennessee. Mountains, thick as molasses and twice as comforting. Maggie glanced toward the kitchen where Jessica was staging what appeared to be a professional photo shoot of her breakfast. "It's educational," she said carefully, moving toward the sliding door that led to the back patio. "Uh-huh. That tone tells me everything I need to know." Ruby May had perfected the art of reading between lines during their 30-year friendship. "What's that daughter-in-law of yours been up to?" Once outside, Maggie let herself settle into the patio chair that faced Tommy Chen's authentic garden rather than Jessica's sterile landscape. She thinks I should spend my recovery watching television and resting." The pause on the other end spoke volumes. Ruby May had been there through Maggie's early years as principal, when male administrators tried to sideline her with similar gentle suggestions about knowing her place. "Lord have mercy, she's trying to put you out to pasture already?" Something like that. Maggie watched Tommy emerge from his back door, coffee mug in hand, surveying his small kingdom of vegetables and herbs. "Ruby May, what do you remember about Jessica from the wedding?" "Sweet as pie in public, cold as a mountain. Spring in January when she thought nobody was looking." Ruby May's voice sharpened with memory. "Spent most of her time networking with David's colleagues, talking about property values and investment opportunities. Made sure everyone knew she'd elevated David's social standing." Maggie filed that observation away. She'd noticed Jessica's careful attention to appearances, but Ruby May's perspective added crucial context. "Did you get a sense of her background?" "Claimed she was from a good family in Memphis, but something about the way she said it felt rehearsed. Like she'd practiced that story until it sounded natural." Ruby May paused. "You thinking there's more to dig up?" "I'm thinking I need to understand what I'm dealing with before I decide how to handle it." After the call ended, Maggie remained on the patio, ostensibly enjoying the morning air but actually observing the neighborhood dynamics. At 10:30, a landscaping truck arrived at the house directly across the street. By 11:15, Tommy had wandered over to chat with the workers. The kind of easy conversation that suggested he knew them well. She made her move when she saw him watering his tomatoes again that afternoon. "Your garden's looking better every day," she called over the fence. Tommy looked up, genuine pleasure crossing his face. "Thanks. It's my therapy, I guess. Keeps my hands busy when my mind gets too loud." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I understand that feeling." Maggie moved closer to the fence line. "Mind if I ask how long you've been in the neighborhood?" "About 18 months, right after my divorce finalized." His expression grew thoughtful. Fresh start seemed like a good idea at the time. "And how has the neighborhood treated you?" Tommy's laugh held an edge of irony. "Let's just say some people have very strong opinions about property aesthetics. Got a formal complaint from the Homeowners Association about my non-conforming landscaping choices within 6 months." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Formal complaint?" Apparently, vegetable gardens don't maintain the desired neighborhood character. Tommy's air quotes conveyed exactly what he thought of that phrase. "Had to present my case at a board meeting, complete with botanical surveys and precedent research." "Sounds like you handled it well." "Had to. My ex used to say I was too passive, that I never fought for anything important." He paused, studying a particularly stubborn tomato plant. "Turns out she was right about the passive part. Wrong about what was worth fighting for." That evening, Maggie positioned herself in the guest room with the door slightly ajar and her book open on her lap, the perfect cover for observation. At 6:45, Jessica's phone rang. The conversation that followed was clearly business-related, but Jessica's voice carried a tension that hadn't been present during her morning performance. "No, I understand the timeline, but these things take time to develop properly." "Yes. I'm aware of the competition, but rushing leads to mistakes." Jessica's voice grew sharper. "I've invested 3 years building relationships in this market. You can't expect overnight results when dealing with high-end properties." The call ended abruptly, followed by the sound of Jessica's heels clicking rapidly across the hardwood, a staccato rhythm that suggested frustration barely held in check. When David arrived home 20 minutes later, Jessica's demeanor had completely transformed. She greeted him with the same polished performance as always, but Maggie noticed the slight strain around her eyes, the way her smile seemed to require more effort. During dinner, Jessica dominated the conversation with updates about a client who was being difficult about perfectly reasonable commission structures and market challenges that were temporary setbacks requiring strategic patience. Oh, David nodded along, but Maggie caught him checking his phone twice, behavior she'd never observed during previous visits. The Henderson deal fell through, Jessica announced suddenly, her fork pausing midway to her mouth. They decided to go with someone who promised them the moon. "I'm sorry," David said, though his response felt automatic. "You'll find other clients." "Of course I will." Jessica's smile was bright and brittle. "It's just frustrating when people don't recognize quality representation." After dinner, as Jessica loaded the dishwasher with mechanical precision, Maggie excused herself for another evening walk. The neighborhood took on a different character after dark. Porch lights revealing glimpses into living rooms where families gathered around dining tables or settled into evening routines. Tommy's house showed warm light in what appeared to be a home office, and she could see him bent over a computer screen. As she passed, he looked up and waved. On impulse, she approached his front porch. "Working late?" she asked. "Freelance graphic design waits for no one," he replied, stepping outside to join her on his front steps. "Plus, my kids are coming this weekend, and I want to clear my schedule." "How old are they?" 15 and 13. They're still adjusting to the whole divorce thing, bouncing between houses. His expression grew thoughtful. "Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, breaking up their stable home life." "Stability isn't always what it appears to be," Maggie observed quietly. "Sometimes what looks stable on the surface is actually quite fragile underneath." Tommy studied her face in the porch light. "Sounds like you're speaking from experience." 35 years of managing teenagers teaches you that the biggest problems usually hide behind the prettiest facades. "Is that what you're dealing with now? Pretty facades?" Maggie considered her answer carefully. "I'm dealing with someone who thinks they can manage me the same way they manage their image. They don't realize that experience teaches you to see through performance." "And what do you see?" "Someone who's more desperate than they appear. Desperation makes people dangerous, but it also makes them careless." Maggie smiled, the expression that had once made rebellious students reconsider their choices. And careless people often reveal more than they intend to. Walking back to David's house, Maggie felt the familiar satisfaction of pieces beginning to fit together. Jessica's professional pressure, her controlling behavior, her careful orchestration of every interaction, it all suggested someone fighting to maintain a position that was less secure than it appeared. Tomorrow, Maggie decided, she would begin testing just how secure that position really was. Maggie woke at 5:15 a.m. with the kind of purposeful energy she hadn't felt since her teaching days. The kitchen was dark and silent, exactly as she'd hoped. Moving quietly in her slippers, she began what would appear to be simple morning preparations, but was actually the first move in a carefully calculated campaign. The kitchen drawers revealed Jessica's obsessive organization, utensils arranged by size, spices alphabetized, everything in its designated place. Maggie began her subtle rearrangement, claiming she needed easier access due to her arthritis. The mixing bowls moved to a lower cabinet. The coffee supplies shifted closer to the machine. Small changes, each defensible as medical accommodation, but collectively disrupting Jessica's carefully controlled environment. By 6:30, she had fresh biscuits in the oven and coffee brewing, the kind of substantial breakfast she'd made for David throughout his childhood. When Jessica appeared at 7:60, her usual morning routine disrupted. Maggie was already setting the table with actual plates instead of Jessica's minimalist breakfast staging. "Oh." Jessica paused in the doorway, her perfect morning composure momentarily fractured. "You're up early." "Old habits," Maggie replied cheerfully, pulling golden biscuits from the oven. "I hope you don't mind. I needed to move a few things around for easier reach. This arthritis, you know. Jessica's smile appeared, but her eyes tracked the subtle changes in her domain. Of course, whatever you need. Though I should mention, David usually prefers lighter fare in the mornings. He always loved my biscuits, Maggie said, splitting, one open and adding butter with practiced efficiency. Some things don't change. When David appeared, his face lit up at the familiar sight and smell. Mom's biscuits. I haven't had these in years. He reached for one before Jessica could redirect him toward her yogurt parfait. I was thinking David might appreciate more traditional breakfasts during my stay, Maggie said, watching Jessica's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Comfort food while I'm recovering. The next phase began that afternoon. Maggie had noticed the back patio's potential during her morning observations. Southern exposure, protection from wind, perfect for container gardening. She'd driven herself to the local nursery, despite Jessica's concerned protests about driving so soon after her episode, and returned with several large pots and autumn-appropriate herbs. I thought some fresh herbs might be nice, Maggie explained as she arranged the containers along the patio's edge. Rosemary, thyme, sage, things that will survive the winter and provide fresh seasoning. Jessica emerged from the house like a general surveying invaded territory. Margaret, I appreciate the thought, but we have a very specific landscape aesthetic. The Homeowners Association has guidelines about. Container gardens aren't regulated, Maggie interrupted mildly, continuing to arrange her pots. I checked the covenant restrictions this morning. Fascinating reading, actually. Did you know they spent 3 pages defining acceptable mailbox designs, but only 1 paragraph on actual gardening? The reference to her research caught Jessica off guard. This wasn't the passive television watching she'd expected. Well, I suppose containers are different, but placement really should coordinate with the existing design elements. These are herbs, dear. Functional, not decorative. Maggie's tone carried the gentle authority she'd used with overeager PTA presidents. Though I suppose fresh rosemary for your cooking might qualify as both. That evening, Maggie implemented the third element of her strategy. At exactly 6 p.m., as Jessica was beginning her dinner preparations, her phone rang. Ruby May! Right on time! Maggie's voice carried clearly from the living room to the kitchen. Yes, I'm settling in wonderfully. David and Jessica are being so accommodating. The conversation stretched through Jessica's cooking time, Maggie's voice providing cheerful commentary about her day's activities, the successful herb planting, her morning baking, her plans for tomorrow's improvements. By the time they sat down for dinner, Jessica's smile had acquired a brittle quality. Was that your friend from back home? Jessica asked with forced brightness. Ruby May Patterson. We taught together for decades. Maggie buttered another biscuit, noting David's obvious enjoyment of the familiar food. She's been keeping me company during my recovery. Such a comfort to have daily check-ins. Daily? The word slipped out before Jessica could catch it. Oh yes, we've talked every evening for 30 years. Habit, you know. Maggie's tone suggested this was perfectly normal rather than a deliberate disruption of Jessica's controlled dinner atmosphere. The following morning brought Maggie's boldest move yet. At 10:30, she knocked on Tommy's front door with a plate of leftover biscuits and an invitation. I was wondering if you'd like to join me for coffee this afternoon, she said. I've been wanting to hear more about your garden successes. Tommy's surprise was genuine. That's very kind. Are you sure? I mean, I'm just the neighbor. You're the neighbor who understands that gardens have personality, Maggie corrected. Besides, I could use some advice about expanding my herb collection. At 2 p.m., Tommy arrived at the front door with a small pot of mint. Thought you might like this for your collection, he said, looking slightly uncertain about the social protocols of visiting a neighbor's houseguest. Jessica's expression when she answered the door was a masterpiece of conflicted courtesy. She couldn't refuse without appearing rude, but she clearly hadn't anticipated Maggie developing independent social connections. "How lovely," Jessica managed, her voice strained. "Margaret, your friend is here." They settled on the back patio with coffee and the remainder of Maggie's biscuits. Tommy proved to be an excellent conversationalist, sharing stories about his children's visits and his freelance design work. More importantly, his presence forced Jessica to either join them, disrupting her afternoon routine, or appear antisocial by staying inside. She chose to hover, appearing periodically with offers of fresh coffee or unnecessary plates, clearly monitoring the conversation while maintaining plausible domestic activity. "Your herb selection shows real knowledge," Tommy was saying, examining Maggie's new plantings. "Most people don't realize how hardy these perennials can be through Tennessee winters. My mother always said the best gardens survived on wisdom, not luck," Maggie replied. "Though I suspect some people prefer gardens that look good rather than ones that actually grow." The comment was ostensibly about plants, but Tommy's slight smile suggested he understood the broader application. That evening, as Jessica loaded the dishwasher with mechanical precision, her movements carried a tension that hadn't been present the week before. David, settled in his usual chair with his tablet, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents, but Maggie noticed his periodic glances toward the kitchen, the behavior of someone sensing conflict without understanding its source. During her evening call with Ruby May, Maggie positioned herself in the living room rather than retreating to her bedroom. "The herb garden is lovely," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the house. "And I've met the most interesting neighbor, Tommy Chen. He's a graphic designer with children who visit on weekends. Very thoughtful man." Ruby May's response was loud enough for anyone listening to hear her approval of Maggie's social expansion. Later, alone in the guest room, Maggie assessed her progress. 3 days of subtle but persistent assertion had yielded telling results. Jessica's perfect morning routine had been disrupted by the kitchen rearrangement and breakfast preparation. Her controlled afternoon schedule was now interrupted by social visits she couldn't prevent without appearing unreasonable. Her evening dominance of conversation was being challenged by Ruby May's strategic calls. Most importantly, Jessica's responses were becoming less controlled, more revealing. The mask of perfect hostess was showing stress fractures, and stressed people made mistakes. Maggie smiled as she turned off the bedside lamp. Tomorrow, she would introduce the next phase of her campaign. Jessica wanted her to be invisible and manageable. She was about to discover that some people became more dangerous the harder you tried to diminish them. The battle for territory had begun, and Maggie was finally playing by her own rules. Maggie found the schedule taped to her bedroom door Friday morning. A neatly typed document titled, "Recovery Plan for Margaret Holloway," with Jessica's real estate letterhead at the top. The professional presentation couldn't disguise what it really was: a declaration of war disguised as medical concern. Thursday a.m., light breakfast, kitchen available until 7:30. 8:15 a.m., 12:15 p.m., rest period, quiet activities recommended. 12:15 p.m., lunch, 1:00 p.m., 4:00 p.m., recovery rest, minimal household activity. 4:00 p.m., 6:00 p.m., personal time, visitors. Should call ahead. 6:00 p.m., dinner, 8:00 p.m., evening wind down, television, reading, quiet activities. At the bottom, in Jessica's precise script, "Following medical guidelines ensures optimal recovery. Thank you for your cooperation in maintaining household harmony." Maggie studied the document with the same analytical attention she'd once applied to student disciplinary reports. The strategy was elegant in its passive aggression: create arbitrary rules under the guise of health concern, then frame any resistance as selfish disregard for recovery. It was the kind of manipulation that looked reasonable to outsiders while systematically stripping away autonomy. She folded the schedule carefully and placed it in her purse. At 9:30 a.m., Precisely during Jessica's designated rest period, Maggie knocked on Tommy's door with a fresh loaf of banana bread and a smile that would have warned her former students to prepare for an unexpected lesson. "I hope I'm not disturbing your work," she said when Tommy answered, looking genuinely pleased but slightly confused by the morning visit. "Not at all. Coffee? That would be lovely." Maggie settled into his kitchen chair, noting the comfortable chaos of a lived-in home. Coffee rings on the table, yesterday's newspaper folded to the crossword, a child's drawing held to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a soccer ball. "How's the recovery going?" Tommy asked, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs. "Interesting question." Maggie pulled out the schedule and smoothed it on his table. "I received my medical guidelines this morning." Tommy read the document, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition to something approaching anger. "This looks familiar," he said quietly. "My ex used to leave me schedules like this. Suggested routines for optimal household efficiency." "And how did you respond?" "Badly. I followed them for 2 years, thinking I was being cooperative." His laugh was rueful. "Took our marriage counselor pointing out that I'd been turned into a child in my own home before I understood what was happening. What would you do differently now?" Tommy considered the question, studying the precise typing and professional letterhead. "I'd probably start by ignoring it completely and seeing what happened next." At exactly 1 p.m., during Jessica's recovery rest period, Maggie began preparing dinner. She had stopped at the grocery store that morning, loading her cart with ingredients for David's favorite childhood meal: pot roast with vegetables, cornbread from scratch, and peach cobbler. For dessert, the kind of cooking that filled a house with warmth and memory. Jessica arrived home from a showing at 2:30 to find her kitchen transformed into active meal preparation. The carefully controlled granite surfaces were covered with cutting boards, mixing bowls, and the comfortable disorder of serious cooking. "Margaret." Jessica's voice carried strained patience. "I thought we discussed the schedule. This is supposed to be your rest time." "I'm feeling much better today," Maggie replied, not looking up from the onions she was chopping. "Thought I'd surprise David with his favorite meal." "That's very thoughtful, but I already planned dinner. There's salmon in the refrigerator, and I made reservations at that new wine bar David mentioned." "You can save the salmon for tomorrow," Maggie said pleasantly. "This will be ready by 6. Jessica's smile grew brittle. "I really think you should follow the recovery guidelines. Overexertion could set back your progress." "Cooking isn't overexertion, dear. It's therapy." Maggie began browning the roast, the sizzle filling the kitchen with familiar sounds. Besides, David hasn't had a proper home-cooked meal in years. The indirect criticism hung in the air like smoke from the searing meat. Jessica's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, the doorbell rang. Through the window, Maggie could see a familiar figure on the front porch, tall, graying, wearing the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to mediating difficult situations. "That'll be Pastor Morrison," Maggie said. "I called him this morning. Thought it might be nice to catch up." Jessica's expression shifted to barely concealed panic. Pastor Morrison had officiated their wedding, knew the family history, and commanded the kind of community respect that made people careful about their behavior in his presence. "Margaret, you should have asked before inviting guests," Jessica managed. "Should I have? I thought this was David's home, too." Maggie wiped her hands on a dish towel. "Besides, Bill's practically family." Pastor Morrison's warm embrace enveloped Maggie in the familiar comfort of old friendship. "Maggie Holloway, you look wonderful. How are you feeling?" "Much better, thanks to the loving care I'm receiving." Her tone was perfectly sincere, while somehow managing to sound slightly ironic. Jessica forced her hostess' smile into place. "Pastor Morrison, what a lovely surprise. Would you like some coffee?" "That would be wonderful, Jessica. Thank you." He settled into the kitchen chair that gave him a clear view of Maggie's cooking preparations. "Something smells incredible in here." "Maggie's making David's favorite meal," Jessica said, her voice carrying forced brightness. "Though I worry she's overdoing it so soon after her health scare." Pastor Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Cooking has always been Maggie's way of showing love. I remember the meals she used to prepare for church potlucks, fed half the congregation single-handedly." "Those were different times," Jessica replied carefully. "Medical understanding of cardiac recovery has evolved significantly." "Indeed it has," a new voice said from the kitchen doorway. A teenage girl with intelligent eyes and an unmistakable resemblance to Pastor Morrison stepped into the room. Though most current research emphasizes the importance of maintaining normal activities and social engagement during recovery, rather than imposed rest, Jessica's smile faltered completely. "And you are?" "Sarah Beth Morrison," the girl replied, with the confidence of someone accustomed to adult conversation. "I volunteer at the senior center and help with their wellness programs. We just completed a module on post-cardiac event recovery protocols." Pastor Morrison's pride in his daughter was evident. "Sarah Beth is quite the advocate for senior citizen rights. She's been working on a social media campaign about ageism in healthcare settings." "How fascinating," Jessica managed, though. Her tone suggested she found it anything but. Sarah Beth moved closer to Maggie's cooking station, inhaling appreciatively. "This smells amazing, Mrs. Holloway. My grandmother always said the best medicine was staying useful and keeping your hands busy." "Your grandmother was a wise woman," Maggie replied, noting how Jessica's composure was cracking under the scrutiny of unexpected witnesses to her control tactics. "Speaking of useful," Sarah Beth continued, pulling out her phone with the casual confidence of her generation, "I've been helping several seniors set up social media accounts to stay connected with their communities. It's amazing how much it helps with feelings of isolation." Jessica's eyes sharpened with alarm. The last thing she needed was Maggie gaining access to public platforms where she might share her experiences. "I'm not sure Margaret is ready for that kind of complexity," Jessica said quickly. "Actually," Maggie interrupted, "I'd be very interested in learning. Ruby May has been encouraging me to join Facebook so I can see pictures of my former students' children." "It's really simple," Sarah Beth said, already moving toward the kitchen table. "We could set up accounts right now if you'd like." "Pastor?" Morrison watched the exchange with growing understanding. His years of counseling troubled families had taught him to recognize power struggles disguised as concern. "Sarah Beth has helped several of our congregation members connect with distant family through social media. It's been wonderful for combating loneliness." The implication was clear. Isolation was harmful, connection was healthy, and anyone opposing such connection might have questionable motives. Jessica excused herself to make a phone call, her composure finally fracturing under the pressure of witnesses who weren't buying her performance. Through the sliding door, they could see her pacing the back patio, her conversation animated with frustrated gestures. "Seems like a stressful time," Pastor Morrison observed quietly. "Change often is," Maggie replied, checking her roast. "Some people adapt better than others." By the time David arrived home at 6:15, the kitchen was filled with the sounds of easy conversation and laughter. Sarah Beth had successfully helped Maggie create Facebook and Instagram accounts. Pastor Morrison was sharing stories about mutual friends from the old days, and the house smelled like the home-cooked memories of David's childhood. Jessica emerged from her phone call with her smile rebuilt, but somehow less convincing than before. She watched David's face light up at the sight of his favorite meal, observed his obvious pleasure in Pastor Morrison's company, and seemed to realize that her carefully constructed schedule had been not just ignored, but publicly dismantled. "This is wonderful, Mom," David said, embracing Maggie warmly. "I haven't smelled pot roast in this house since." He paused, perhaps realizing the implication of his words. Since someone started making real food again, Pastor Morrison finished diplomatically. That evening, after their guests had left, and David had expressed his gratitude for the familiar comfort of his mother's cooking, Jessica made one final attempt to reassert control. "Margaret, I hope you understand that the schedule wasn't meant to restrict you. It was designed to ensure your health remained the priority. I appreciate your concern," Maggie replied, loading the dishwasher with the satisfaction of someone who had fed people she loved. "But I think my health is best served by staying active and connected." "Of course, but moderation is key." "Indeed it is," Maggie agreed. "Moderation in all things, including the urge to control other people's lives." The words hung in the air between them, polite but unmistakably clear. Jessica's schedule lay forgotten on the counter, and Maggie's social media notifications were already beginning to chime with friend requests from old colleagues and students. The battle lines had been drawn, and Maggie had just gained some very powerful allies. The discovery came by accident, or perhaps by the kind of providence that rewards patient observation. Maggie was returning Jessica's borrowed gardening gloves to the mudroom when a manila folder slipped from the cluttered desk, spilling its contents across the tile floor. As she knelt to gather the scattered papers, her principal's eye for detail caught inconsistencies that made her pause. The letterhead read Pinnacle Properties Group with Jessica's name listed as senior associate, but the documents beneath told a different story. Credit card statements showing mounting debt, bank notices about missed payments, a letter from a former business partner demanding repayment of a $15,000 loan. Most damning of all, a termination notice from her previous real estate firm, dated 6 months ago. Maggie photographed the papers quickly with her phone, a skill Sarah Beth had taught her just days earlier, before carefully arranging them as she'd found them. Her hands were steady, but her mind raced with the implications. Jessica's perfect facade was built on a foundation of financial desperation and professional failure. That afternoon, while Jessica was at what she claimed was a high-priority client showing, Maggie called Ruby May with a request that would have seemed impossible just a week ago. "I need you to make some phone calls," Maggie said, settling into the back patio chair that had become her command post. "Remember your cousin Dolores who works at the courthouse in Memphis?" "Course I do. What are you thinking, sugar?" "I need to know about Jessica's background. Real background, not the story she tells at dinner parties." Maggie watched a hawk circle overhead, patient and methodical in its hunting. Marriage records, property ownership, anything public that might contradict her claims about her good family in Memphis. Ruby May's chuckle was wickedly delighted. "Oh, honey, you're about to get an education. Dolores loves a good mystery, and she's got access to records going back decades." While waiting for Ruby May's investigation, Maggie began her own reconnaissance, closer to home. David's behavior had been troubling her, the way he checked his phone constantly, his increasing distance during Jessica's monologues about her real estate success, the lines of stress around his eyes that hadn't been there during his last visit to her home. She found her opportunity that evening when Jessica left for another mysterious client dinner, and David settled into his home office with a glass of wine that wasn't his first. Maggie knocked softly on the doorframe. "Mind if I join you? I feel like we haven't really talked since I arrived." David looked up from his computer screen, and Maggie was startled by the weariness in his expression. "Of course, Mom. Come in." She settled into the chair across from his desk, noting the framed photo of Jessica that had been turned face down. "How are you doing, really? You seem tired." The question seemed to open a floodgate David had been desperately trying to keep closed. "I am tired," he admitted, running his hands through his hair. "Tired of pretending everything's perfect, tired of walking on eggshells, tired of feeling like nothing I do is good enough." "Good enough for whom?" David's laugh was bitter. "Jessica has very specific ideas about how our life should look. The right neighborhood, the right friends, the right image. Sometimes I feel like I'm playing a role in her production rather than living my own life. Maggie leaned forward slightly. When did that feeling start? Honestly? About 2 years ago, when her real estate career hit some rough patches and she became obsessed with maintaining appearances. Every conversation became about networking, about positioning ourselves for better opportunities. He picked up the photo frame, staring at Jessica's professional headshot. She started talking about you differently then, too. Before, she'd always spoken respectfully about your teaching career. But lately, she calls it quaint. It says you lived in a simpler time when people didn't understand about building wealth and status. David's voice grew quieter. She's been pushing me to suggest you sell the house in Cookville, move to some kind of senior community. Says it's about your safety. But I think it's really about eliminating anything that reminds people of who I was before I became a convenient burden. David's wince confirmed her suspicion. I hate that you heard her that way. But yes, I think that's part of it. Ruby May's call came the next morning while Jessica was at the gym, her daily routine that Maggie had learned to count on for private conversations. Sugar, sit down for this one, Ruby May began without preamble. Your daughter-in-law's got more stories than a used car salesman. Tell me. First off, she's not from any good family in Memphis. Dolores found her birth certificate. Father unknown, mother worked 3 jobs to keep them in a trailer park off Lamar Avenue. Nothing wrong with that, mind you. But it's not the story she's been selling. Maggie felt a complex mix of emotions, vindication at having her suspicions confirmed, but also unexpected sympathy for the young woman who had fought her way out of poverty, only to build her new life on lies. There's more, Ruby May continued. She was married before David. Twice, actually. First marriage lasted 8 months, second one 3 years. Both ended in divorce with financial complications. And get this, she's been using fake credentials about her education. Claims she graduated from Vanderbilt, but Dolores couldn't find any record of enrollment. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Jessica's desperate need for status, her careful cultivation of David's family connections, her terror of anything that might expose the truth about her background. Ruby May, I need you to be very careful about how you use this information. I'm not interested in destroying someone out of spite. Course not, honey. But you need to protect yourself. Someone that desperate to hide their past might do anything to keep their secrets safe. That afternoon brought an unexpected gift in the form of genuine conversation with David. He had taken a half-day from work, claiming he needed to handle some personal business. But Maggie suspected he simply needed escape from his increasingly tense home environment. They sat together on the back patio, David helping her tend the herb garden that had become both symbol and battleground of her, resistance to Jessica's control. I've been thinking about what you said last night, Maggie began carefully. About feeling like you're playing a role. David's hand stilled on the rosemary plant he was watering. I shouldn't have said that. Jessica works hard. She's under a lot of pressure. David. Maggie's voice carried the gentle authority that had once guided him through teenage troubles. You're allowed to have feelings about your own marriage. The simple permission seemed to crack something open in her son. I miss us, he said quietly. The way we used to be. She used to laugh at my terrible jokes, used to curl up with me on Sundays to watch football. Now everything's about appearances, about what other people think, about positioning ourselves for the next opportunity. When did that change? About the time her business started struggling. She'd come home frustrated and angry, but instead of talking about it, she'd focus on controlling everything else. What we ate, how we decorated, who we socialized with. David's voice grew thoughtful. And especially how we handled family obligations. The phrase family obligations hit Maggie like a physical blow. Is that what I am? An obligation? To her, yes. She's made that clear. David's honesty was painful but necessary. She sees you as a complication, something that doesn't fit the image she's trying to project. And what do you see me as? David looked up from the herb garden, his eyes bright with unshed tears. As my mother. As the woman who raised me to believe I could be anything I wanted to be. As someone I've failed to protect when you needed me most. That evening, Maggie sat in her room organizing the information she'd gathered like evidence. In a case file. Financial documents proving Jessica's lies about her success. Ruby May's research revealing the fabricated background story. David's admission about the deteriorating state of his marriage, and Jessica's true feelings about Maggie's presence. The question was no longer what Jessica was hiding. It was how far she might go to keep those secrets buried. Someone who had built their entire identity on lies would fight desperately to maintain them, especially when their financial security and social standing hung in the balance. Maggie's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Beth. Mrs. H, someone's been asking questions about your FB posts at school. Thought you should know. Want me to help you set privacy settings? The message sent a chill through Maggie. Jessica was already moving to contain the potential damage from Maggie's new social connections. The battle was escalating, and Jessica was beginning to feel cornered. Cornered people, Maggie knew from 35 years of dealing with desperate students and parents, were capable of remarkably poor decisions. The question was whether Jessica would retreat or attack, and whether Maggie was prepared for either possibility. Looking at the evidence spread across her bed, Maggie realized she was holding enough ammunition to destroy Jessica's carefully constructed life. The question now was whether she would need to use it, and what Jessica might do to stop her. The dinner party was Jessica's idea. 8 of her most important real estate colleagues gathered around the dining room table she'd set with her grandmother's china. At least that's what she claimed as she polished each piece with obsessive care. Maggie suspected the family heirloom story was as fabricated as everything else about Jessica's carefully constructed past. I thought it would be nice for you to meet some of Nashville's most successful professionals, Jessica had announced that morning, her tone suggesting she was offering Maggie a rare privilege. Though perhaps you should eat earlier, in the kitchen. These business discussions can be quite complex. The dismissal was so blatant that even David looked uncomfortable. Mom should join us, he said quietly. She's excellent company. Jessica's smile tightened imperceptibly. Of course, if she feels up to it. Though I worry the evening might be overwhelming after such a long recovery. Maggie recognized the setup immediately, another attempt to marginalize her, this time in front of witnesses who would see only Jessica's solicitous concern for her elderly mother-in-law's well-being. It was masterfully done, and 6 months ago, Maggie might have graciously retreated to spare everyone discomfort. But 6 months ago, she hadn't understood how much she had to lose. I'd love to join you, Maggie said pleasantly. I so rarely get to hear about modern business practices. The guests arrived at 7, a carefully curated collection of Nashville's rising real estate elite. Jessica moved among them like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, her laugh perfectly pitched, her anecdotes precisely calibrated to demonstrate her insider knowledge and professional connections. Maggie sat quietly through the first course, observing the performance. Jessica name-dropped clients, referenced exclusive listings, and spoke with authority about market trends that painted her as an industry insider rather than someone desperately clinging to relevance. Of course, the Belle Meade market requires a very sophisticated approach, Jessica was explaining to Brad Morrison, a colleague Maggie recognized from the newspaper's real estate section. You can't just rely on standard marketing. My clients expect white glove service and exclusive access. Absolutely, Brad agreed. Though I have to say, this market's been brutal lately. Half my team's struggling to close deals. Jessica's fork paused almost imperceptibly before she recovered. The cream always rises to the top. Quality service finds its market, even in challenging times. It was then that Maggie noticed the subtle signs of strain in Jessica's performance. The too bright smile, the slight tremor in her hand when she reached for her wine glass, the way her responses came a beat too quickly, as if rehearsed. "Margaret," Jessica turned suddenly, her voice carrying forced warmth. "Why don't you tell everyone about your teaching career? I'm sure they'd find your stories from simpler times quite charming." The phrase simpler times hung in the air, like a challenge. Around the table, faces turned toward Maggie with polite interest, tinged with the condescension reserved for elderly relatives sharing quaint memories. "Education has certainly evolved," Maggie began mildly. "Though some things remain constant. The ability to read people, for instance. To recognize when someone's presenting a facade versus authentic substance." Jessica's eyes sharpened, recognizing the subtle threat. "In my experience," Maggie continued, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades managing difficult situations, "the most important skill in dealing with people is verification. Students learned quickly that I always checked their stories against documentation." "How thorough of you," Jessica said, her smile becoming brittle. "Essential, really. You'd be amazed how creative people can be when constructing alternative versions of reality." Maggie's tone remained conversational, but several guests were beginning to sense undercurrents they didn't understand. "Speaking of verification," Maggie continued, pulling out her phone with the casual confidence Sarah Beth had taught her, "I've been reconnecting with old colleagues through social media. It's fascinating what public records can reveal when you know where to look." Jessica's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "For instance," Maggie said, her voice still pleasant but carrying an edge that made David look up sharply, "I discovered some interesting discrepancies about educational backgrounds and professional histories. Amazing how much information is available these days." "Margaret," Jessica's voice carried a warning that was audible to everyone at the table, "perhaps we should discuss your confusion privately." The word confusion was perfectly chosen, suggesting cognitive decline without stating it directly. Around the table, expressions shifted to uncomfortable sympathy for the elderly woman who was clearly becoming problematic. But Maggie had spent 35 years dealing with manipulators who thought they were cleverer than they were. Confusion? Maggie's eyebrows rose with the expression that had once made school board members reconsider their assumptions. "I think my mind is quite clear. Clear enough, for instance, to recognize when someone suggests I need professional care because I'm becoming an inconvenient truth-teller." The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica's mask had slipped completely, revealing desperation and barely controlled panic. "That's enough," Jessica snapped, her composure finally cracking. "You're embarrassing yourself and everyone else. Maybe it's time to consider that your age is affecting your judgment." "My judgment." Maggie's voice carried 35 years of quiet authority. "My judgment tells me that someone who lies about their education, fabricates their family background, and hides their business failures while manipulating their spouse might be the one with questionable decision-making skills." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. Around the table, professional colleagues who prided themselves on discretion and insider knowledge suddenly realized they were witnessing something far more explosive than a family disagreement. Brad Morrison's expression shifted to sharp interest. "Business failures?" Jessica stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood. "Margaret is clearly having some kind of episode. David, I think we need to call her doctor." But David was staring at his mother with growing understanding. "What business failures, Mom?" Maggie met her son's eyes with compassion and resolve. "The termination from her previous firm 6 months ago, the mounting debt, the fake credentials about Vanderbilt." She paused, watching Jessica's face cycle through denial, rage, and finally, desperate calculation. You want to play this game? Jessica's voice was no longer the polished hostess, but something raw and dangerous. Fine. Let's talk about inconvenient truths. Like how you manipulated your way into this house, disrupted our lives, and are now trying to destroy my marriage because you can't accept that you're no longer relevant. The accusation hung in the air, but Maggie's response was calm and devastating in its simplicity. Jessica, the only person who's destroyed anything here is you. I've simply refused to disappear quietly while you tried to erase me. Around the table, 8 successful professionals sat frozen, witnessing the complete implosion of Jessica's carefully constructed world. Her professional reputation, her social standing, her marriage, all of it crumbling in real time. Jessica's final words came out as a desperate snarl. Get out! Get out of my house! It's not your house, David said quietly, standing behind his mother's chair. It's ours, and she's not going anywhere. The battle was over. Jessica had lost everything she'd fought so desperately to protect, and everyone in the room had witnessed her complete destruction. The house felt different. In the aftermath, heavier, as if the very walls had absorbed the shock of the previous evening's revelations. Maggie woke at dawn to the sound of Jessica's heels clicking frantically across the hardwood floors, punctuated by the sharp snap of suitcase latches and dresser drawers being yanked open. By 7 a.m., Jessica was gone, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note on the kitchen counter. Staying at the Hermitage Hotel until I can make other arrangements. We'll talk when you're ready to be reasonable. David stood in the kitchen doorway, still in his pajamas, holding the note like evidence of a crime he couldn't quite believe had been committed. His hair was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night, and Maggie's heart clenched at the sight of her grown son looking so lost. I should have seen it, he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. All of it. How did I not see what was happening? Maggie poured coffee into 2 mugs, noting absently that Jessica had taken her expensive espresso machine, but left the simple coffee maker that actually worked reliably. Sometimes we don't see what we don't want to see, she said gently, especially when acknowledging it means facing difficult choices. She made me feel like I was losing my mind, David continued, sinking into a kitchen chair. Every time I questioned something, she'd explain it away so reasonably, made me think I was being paranoid or ungrateful. The phone rang at 8:30. Brad Morrison from last night's dinner party. His voice was carefully professional, but Maggie could hear the curiosity beneath his courtesy. David, I wanted to reach out after last evening. Is Jessica available? I have some questions about a listing she mentioned. David's knuckles whitened as he gripped the phone. Jessica's not available. Right now, Brad. And honestly, I think you should verify any claims she made independently. The pause that followed spoke volumes. I see. Well, if circumstances change. 3 more calls followed in similar vein. Colleagues suddenly needing clarification about Jessica's representations. Clients questioning commitments she'd made. Professional contacts diplomatically distancing themselves from someone whose credibility had imploded publicly. By noon, David had fielded 6 calls and 3 emails, each one driving home the scope of Jessica's professional destruction. Her career, built on relationships and reputation in Nashville's tight-knit real estate community, was effectively over. I feel sick, David said, after hanging up from yet another uncomfortable conversation. Not because of what happened to her career, but because part of me feels relieved. Maggie understood. The relief wasn't cruelty, it was the exhale after holding your breath for years. Tommy appeared at the back door around 2 p.m. with a casserole dish and the kind of determined kindness that emerges after neighborhood drama. Figured you folks might not be up for cooking today, he said, his eyes taking in David's hollow expression and Maggie's carefully controlled composure. News travels fast in this neighborhood. Maggie observed. Catering truck arrived this morning to clean up from the dinner party, Tommy explained gently. Driver mentioned there'd been some kind of scene. People are concerned. David laughed bitterly. Concerned about the property values, more likely. Having the neighborhood crazy lady's marriage fall apart in public probably doesn't help the home prices. Actually, Tommy said, settling into the chair Jessica had claimed as her territory. Just days before, most people are relieved. Jessica wasn't exactly beloved around here. Too many complaints to the homeowners association. Too much looking down on anyone who didn't meet her standards. The revelation hit David visibly. She told me everyone respected her attention to neighborhood standards. She told you a lot of things, Maggie said quietly. That afternoon brought a visit from Pastor Morrison, who arrived with the careful bearing of someone trained to navigate family crises. He found David in the backyard, mechanically deadheading the flowers in Jessica's pristine garden beds. "How are you holding up, son?" Pastor Morrison asked, settling on the patio steps with the patience of someone prepared to listen for however long it took. "I keep thinking about the last 3 years," David said without looking up from the flowers. "Every conversation, every decision, every time she made me feel like my judgment was wrong. I started second-guessing everything, my work, my friendships, even my relationship with Mom." "Manipulation is insidious that way," Pastor Morrison replied. "It doesn't announce itself. It creeps in gradually until you can't trust your own perceptions anymore." "She was drowning," David continued, his voice growing stronger with understanding. "Her business was failing, her background was a lie, and instead of asking for help or being honest, she decided to control everything around her to maintain the illusion." "And what does that make you feel?" David was quiet for a long moment, considering. Angry, sad, and guilty for feeling relieved that it's over. That evening, as the autumn sun cast long shadows across the disrupted household, Maggie found herself facing an unexpected crisis of conscience. She had won. Jessica's authority was destroyed, her manipulation exposed, her ability to marginalize Maggie eliminated completely. But the victory felt hollow in ways she hadn't anticipated. She called Ruby May, needing the perspective of someone who understood the cost of necessary battles. "You did what you had to do, sugar," Ruby May said after hearing about the confrontation. "That woman was systematically erasing you from your own family. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to show them you're not afraid to fight back." "But David's marriage is over. His life is turned upside down. What if I push too hard?" "Maggie Holloway, you listen to me." Ruby May's voice carried the authority of 3 decades of friendship. "That marriage was poisoned long before you arrived. You didn't destroy it. You just refused to let it destroy you, too." The truth of that statement settled over Maggie like a weight. She had been fighting for her own survival, her own dignity, her own place in her son's life. The fact that Jessica's lies couldn't survive scrutiny wasn't Maggie's fault. It was the inevitable consequence of building a life on deception. But understanding the necessity of her actions didn't eliminate the complexity of their consequences. David was free, but he was also devastated. Jessica's manipulation was exposed, but she was also professionally ruined. The truth had prevailed, but truth often carried a heavy price. As night fell over the suburban neighborhood, Maggie sat in the guest room that no longer felt like a temporary space. Through her window, she could see Tommy's house where warm light spilled from the kitchen, and beyond that, the other homes where families were settling into their evening routines. For the first time in weeks, the house was quiet, not with the artificial silence of suppressed tension, but with the genuine peace that comes after a storm has passed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult conversations, and the complex work of rebuilding relationships damaged by years of manipulation and control. But tonight, Maggie allowed herself to acknowledge a simple truth. She was still here, She had refused to be erased, refused to accept marginalization, refused to disappear quietly into the role of convenient burden. The cost had been high, but some battles were worth their price, and sometimes the only way to save a family was to force it to confront the lies it had been living. The morning light filtered through Pastor Morrison's office windows with the gentleness of forgiveness itself, but the three people seated in the circle of chairs felt anything but peaceful. 2 weeks had passed since the dinner party disaster, and the Holloway family sat like survivors of a shipwreck, each clutching their own piece of floating debris while trying to decide whether to swim toward shore together or apart. Maggie smoothed. Her navy dress, the same one she'd worn to countless school board meetings where she'd had to negotiate between angry parents and frustrated teachers. Jessica sat across from her, looking smaller somehow without her usual armor of perfect makeup and designer clothes. David occupied the chair between them, literally and figuratively caught in the middle, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Pastor Morrison settled into his own chair with the practiced ease of someone who'd mediated more family conflicts than he cared to count. "I'm grateful you all agreed to come," he said, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him beloved in their community for over a decade. "Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones we need most." Jessica spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to say something before we start." She looked directly at Maggie, and for the first time since they'd known each other, her expression held no calculation, no performance. "I've been thinking about what you said at the dinner party, about the couple in their 70s, the ones I helped negotiate a lower price." Her hands trembled slightly. "You were right. I took advantage of them." The admission hung in the air like incense, heavy and transformative. David shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with his wife's vulnerability. But Maggie found herself leaning forward, recognizing something she'd seen countless times in her office, the moment when a student finally stopped making excuses and faced the truth. "I grew up poor," Jessica continued, the words coming faster now, as if she were afraid she'd lose her courage. "Really poor. Food bank poor. Eviction notice poor. My mama cleaned houses for rich families in Memphis, and I used to go with her sometimes during school breaks." She paused, gathering strength. "I swore I'd never be powerless like that again. Never be the person someone else looked down on." Maggie felt something inside her chest loosen. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. She'd seen this fear before, in students who acted out because they were terrified of being seen as stupid, in parents who bulldozed through school policies because they felt powerless everywhere else in their lives. "So you decided to be the one doing the looking down," Maggie said, not unkindly. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "I thought if I could just get high enough, be successful enough, no one would ever see that scared little girl again. But you—" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "You saw right through me, and instead of just accepting my treatment, you fought back. You reminded me that I'd become exactly the kind of person I used to hate." David finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew about your childhood, Jess. Why didn't you tell me you were still carrying all that pain?" "Because I was afraid you'd see me differently, see me as less than—" Jessica turned to him, her vulnerability raw and complete. "Your family has this quiet dignity, this certainty about who you are. I was terrified that if you knew how desperate I was to belong somewhere, anywhere, you'd realize you'd made a mistake marrying me." Pastor Morrison leaned forward gently. "And David, how did you handle your wife's insecurities? Did you help her feel secure in your love?" David's face crumpled. "I avoided everything. Any time there was tension, I just disappeared. Worked late, changed the subject, pretended everything was fine." He looked at Maggie with eyes that reminded her of the little boy who used to apologize for his father's absences. "And Mom? I let Jessica treat you badly because confronting it would have meant admitting my marriage wasn't perfect. I was so afraid of conflict that I sacrificed your dignity to keep the peace. The words hit Maggie like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She'd raised a son who would rather enable cruelty than face difficult conversations. Part of that was David's nature, but part of it, she had to admit, was her own doing. She'd protected him too much from his father's weaknesses, smoothed over too many rough patches. I have something to confess too, Maggie said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. I came here planning to prove I belonged in this family. But the truth is, I've been just as afraid as both of you. Afraid of being forgotten, afraid of becoming irrelevant, afraid that maybe Jessica was right. Maybe I was just a burden taking up space in your lives. She looked at David, seeing not the successful engineer but the uncertain boy who'd needed so much reassurance. I taught you to avoid conflict because I was avoiding it myself. Your father and I never learned how to fight fair, how to disagree, without damaging each other. When he left that time, I was so focused on protecting you from the chaos that I never taught you how to handle it. Pastor Morrison nodded slowly. Fear makes us all do things that don't align with our values. Jessica, your fear made you cruel. David, your fear made you passive. And Maggie, your fear made you defensive. But here's what I've learned in 20 years of ministry. Fear loses its power when we bring it into the light. Jessica was crying, openly now. I don't know how to be different. I don't know how to stop being afraid that everyone's going to leave me if I'm not perfect enough. You start by being honest, Maggie said, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice. You start by trusting that love isn't something you earn by being perfect. It's something you build by being real. David reached for both women's hands, his own shaking. I want to learn how to be brave, how to have hard conversations instead of running away from them. I want to be the kind of husband and son who protects the people he loves, even when it's uncomfortable. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their admissions settling around them like dust after a demolition. Pastor. Morrison smiled, the expression of someone who'd witnessed many small resurrections in this office. Healing doesn't happen overnight, he said, but it starts with exactly this: the courage to see each other clearly and choose love anyway. Not the love that ignores problems, but the love that works through them. As they prepared to leave, Jessica turned to Maggie one final time. I don't expect you to forgive me immediately. I know I have to earn your trust back, but I want you to know I don't want to be the kind of person who treats family like inconveniences anymore. Maggie studied her daughter-in-law's face, seeing past the perfect features to the wounded girl beneath. Forgiveness isn't about you earning it, Jessica. It's about me choosing to stop carrying the weight of your mistakes. But trust? She paused. Trust we'll have to build together, one honest conversation at a time. Outside the church, the Tennessee autumn had begun in earnest, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson. The three of them stood on the steps, no longer quite the same people who'd entered an hour earlier. They had a long way to go, but for the first time in months, they were walking in the same direction. The question now wasn't whether they could heal. The question was whether they had the courage to keep choosing honesty over comfort, growth over stagnation, love over fear. Only time would tell. 6 months later, the March air in Nashville carried the promise of spring, and the house on Magnolia Creek Drive had transformed in ways that went far deeper than the fresh coat of paint on the shutters. Maggie stood in the kitchen, her kitchen now, she'd learned to think of it, arranging wildflowers in a mason jar while the smell of her famous chess pie filled the air. Today was her 69th birthday, and for the first time in years, she was genuinely excited about celebrating. The kitchen itself told the story of their journey. Jessica's pristine granite countertops now bore the comfortable scars of daily use. Flour stains from Maggie's baking sessions, ring marks from coffee mugs during their morning conversations, and a small chip near the sink where David had dropped a cast-iron skillet during one of his cooking experiments. The sterile perfection had given way to something warmer, more lived in, more real. "Mrs. Holloway, you're going to love this," Sarah Beth Morrison called from the dining room where she was setting up her laptop. At 17 now, the pastor's daughter had become an unexpected bridge between generations, teaching Maggie about social media while learning about resilience and quiet revolution. "I finished the digital scrapbook last night. Wait until you see the photos I found from the farmer's market last month." Maggie smiled, wiping her hands on the apron that had once belonged to her mother. The farmer's market had become one of her favorite weekly traditions, a place where she could use her gift for connecting with people while Jessica practiced being genuine instead of performative. They'd started going together 3 months ago, after a particularly honest conversation about loneliness and belonging. The front door opened with a familiar creak that David kept promising to fix, but that Maggie secretly loved. Ruby May's voice preceded her into the house, carrying that thick Tennessee accent like a banner of authenticity. "Lord have mercy, something smells like heaven in here." Ruby May appeared in the kitchen doorway, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Please tell me you made enough chess pie for seconds, because I've been dreaming about your grandmother's recipe for 3 days. "I made 2, Maggie laughed, embracing her oldest friend. "One for today and one for you to take home. You know how David gets when there's no leftovers." Ruby May had driven up from their hometown for the celebration, bringing with her not just moral support, but a photo album filled with pictures from Maggie's years as principal. The images showed a woman in her element, mediating between feuding parents, celebrating with graduating seniors, standing firm against budget cuts that would have devastated her school's programs. It was a reminder of who she'd been before: the heart attack, before the displacement, before she'd had to fight for her place in her own family. "Where's that daughter-in-law of yours?" Ruby May asked, settling into one of the kitchen chairs they'd moved in to create a more welcoming space. "I hear she's been making some changes." "She's picking up Tommy from the airport," Maggie replied, checking the pie through the oven window. His flight from Portland got delayed. The friendship with Tommy Chen had evolved over the months into something precious and uncomplicated. He understood the challenge of rebuilding identity after displacement, and she appreciated his quiet wisdom about navigating family dynamics. Jessica had initially been suspicious of their friendship, seeing it as another threat to her carefully managed social circle. But gradually, she'd come to understand that Maggie's happiness didn't diminish her own standing in the community; it enhanced it. David appeared in the doorway, his hair mussed from yard work and his face carrying a contentment that had been absent for years. The physical changes in him were subtle but significant: straighter posture, steadier eye contact, and a willingness to voice opinions instead of deflecting to Jessica's preferences. "Mom, the garden looks incredible. Those tomato plants you started are already twice the size of anything I've ever grown." He kissed her cheek, leaving a slight smudge of dirt that she didn't bother to wipe away. "Jess texted that they're 5 minutes out. She wanted me to warn you that Tommy brought a surprise." The surprise turned out to be his daughter Maya, a college sophomore studying social work who'd heard so much about Maggie that she'd rearranged her spring break plans to attend the birthday celebration. The young woman had her father's quiet intensity and an infectious enthusiasm for stories about challenging authority and fighting for justice. "Mrs. Holloway," Maya said, settling comfortably at the kitchen table while Tommy and Jessica brought in bags from their airport run. "Dad told me about your revolution. I'm writing a paper about ageism and intergenerational relationships for my sociology class. Would you mind if I interviewed you sometime?" "Only if you call me Maggie," she replied, pleased by the young woman's directness. "And only if you're prepared to hear about the time I locked 3 school board members in a conference room until they agreed to restore the music program budget." The afternoon unfolded with the easy rhythm of genuine celebration. Pastor Morrison arrived with his wife and Sarah Beth, followed by several neighbors who'd become friends rather than mere acquaintances. The gathering was smaller than the elaborate parties Jessica used to throw, but it carried a warmth that had been missing from those carefully orchestrated events. As they gathered around the dining room table for dinner, Maggie looked at the faces surrounding her and marveled at the journey that had brought them here. Jessica sat to her right, her expression softer than it had been in years. The therapy sessions had helped, but more importantly, she'd found work with a nonprofit that developed affordable housing for seniors, a job that paid less than her real estate career, but fed her soul in ways that closing deals never had. "Before we eat," Jessica said, standing and clearing her throat nervously, "I have something I want to say." She looked directly at Maggie, her hands trembling slightly. "6 months ago, I was terrified of you, not because of anything you did, but because you represented everything I thought I wasn't good enough for. Dignity, authenticity, quiet strength. I tried to make you smaller so I could feel bigger." The room fell silent, even Sarah Beth looking up from her phone to pay attention. "But you didn't get smaller," Jessica continued, her voice growing stronger. "You got bigger. You showed me what real strength looks like, and you did it with grace even when I didn't deserve it." She paused, wiping away tears. "You saved my marriage by refusing to let me destroy it with my fear. You saved my relationship with David by forcing us to have conversations we'd been avoiding for years. And you saved me from becoming someone I wouldn't have been able to live with." She lifted her wine glass, her smile genuine and unguarded. "So this toast isn't just for your birthday, Maggie. It's for the woman who taught us all that family isn't about keeping the peace. It's about fighting for what matters. Happy birthday to the strongest person I know." The chorus of agreement that followed was heartfelt and unanimous. David raised his own glass, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "To Mom, who taught me that avoiding conflict doesn't protect the people you love. Standing up for them does." As they ate and talked and laughed, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged. Not because she'd been accommodated or tolerated, but because she'd fought for her place and won it through stubborn persistence and uncompromising love. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah Beth presented her with the digital scrapbook she'd created. The images told the story of their journey. Photos from the farmer's market, screenshots of social media posts about the importance of listening to elders, pictures from David and Jessica's renewed wedding, vows ceremony where Maggie had served as Jessica's matron of honor. "Look at this one," Sarah Beth said, pointing to a photo Tommy had taken of Maggie teaching Maya to make biscuits from scratch. "This is going to be the cover of my project about intergenerational wisdom. You can see the exact moment when someone who thinks they know everything realizes they have so much to learn." As the house settled into quiet around them, the 3 core members of the Holloway family found themselves alone in the living room. David had built a small fire in the fireplace, something Jessica had once considered too messy for her perfect home, but now requested regularly. They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about how far they'd traveled together. "I have an announcement," David said finally, his voice carrying a mix of nervousness and excitement. "Jess and I have been talking, and we've decided to start the adoption process. We want to give a child the kind of home we've learned to build. Here, one where people can be imperfect and still be loved." Maggie felt her heart swell with a joy so profound it threatened to overwhelm her. "A grandchild," she whispered, the word carrying all the hope and promise of futures yet to be written. "A grandchild who will grow up knowing their great-grandmother," Jessica added, reaching for Maggie's hand. "A child who will learn from your stories about standing up for what's right, about fighting with grace, about the difference between keeping peace and making peace." As they talked about the future, about the child who would grow up in this house, about the lessons they'd learned and the ones they were still learning, Maggie realized that her quiet revolution had accomplished something far greater than she'd imagined. She hadn't just secured her place in the family, she'd helped create a family worth belonging to. The March wind rattled the windows gently, carrying with it the scent of new growth and fresh possibilities. Outside, spring was beginning in earnest, painting the world in shades of hope and renewal. Inside the house on Magnolia Creek Drive, 3 people who'd almost lost each other had found something infinitely more valuable than the peace they'd once mistaken for harmony. They'd found the courage to love each other truthfully, completely, and without reservation. And in that courage, Margaret Holloway had discovered the greatest victory of all, not just the right to grow old with dignity, but the privilege of growing old surrounded by people brave enough to grow alongside her. The quiet revolution was complete, but the real work, the daily choice to choose love over fear, honesty over comfort, growth over stagnation, would continue for all the years to come. And Maggie Holloway, at 69 years old, had never been more ready for the challenge. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.